So around a year ago when I was launching Mind and Soil, I would have been so nervous and afraid to put this video out there to share my garden fails and flops from the past season because I felt such a pressure to be this perfect gardener so that I could be trusted with the education and products that we have. But I also knew deep down that part of that wasn't 100% true to me because I am such a big believer in how important and inevitable garden flops and fails are for each and every gardener out there. And I'm going to shed more light on that later on, but what I want to dive into is my 6 biggest and most epic garden flops and fails from this season, but also what I have learned from each one of them. So my first epic fail here is that we can see all of these seeds that have germinated and started to grow into little plants, or as more commonly referred to as weeds. And these are all growing in a garden bed now. And why is this happening? Well, it's happening because the hot compost that I make, in order for seeds to die off, it needs to be 120 Fahrenheit. And at the center of my pile, it is 120, 130, even up into 140 Fahrenheit. So they would die off. But as you get away from that central core, it gets cooler and cooler. And therefore a lot of the seeds that would be sitting on the outside of that hot compost pile aren't actually dying off. So when they get back into the bed, they're going to germinate and begin to grow. So what am I taking from this? Well, the first good news is that I don't mind weeding at all. I really enjoy just spending time in the garden, getting my hands dirty, pulling out the weeds. But the downside is that some of those weeds are mint, oregano, and when they begin to grow, it's really difficult to then get them permanently out of the garden. And those got into my compost because I grabbed yard waste or garden waste from the community garden where I'm not familiar with what all of the inputs are. So moving forward, the learning for me is that I won't be grabbing yard waste and garden waste from that community garden because I don't know what those inputs are, and I want to have more control over what my hot compost pile has within it, and ultimately then ending up back in my garden. Okay, so my second big garden flop and fail from this past season was my broccoli. Now it was growing beautifully and was absolutely primed in a great position to develop into beautiful heads of broccoli. But as we got to June, we got hit by this really big heat wave where it was unseasonably warm, and every one of those broccoli plants except for one ultimately bolted, went to flower, and did not develop into big and beautiful heads of broccoli. Now the good news is that I was able to salvage a lot of those plants and put them into broccoli soups that I'm able to enjoy now through the winter, but it wasn't the result that I was looking for. So what am I learning from this and taking into next season? Well, next year I'm going to plant 2 rounds of broccoli. I'm going to do that same spring crop that I hope to harvest in June, but then I'm going to do a succession crop so that it can hopefully get into the beds and grow kind of in its earlier stages with that nice warm sun over the course of the summer. And as it starts to get towards maturity, I'm hoping that that will line up with the temperatures cooling off and dipping into fall so that it is less likely to bolt and more likely to turn into a beautiful head of broccoli. If any of you have had a lot of success growing broccoli, please leave what has worked for you when you plant it. Any tips that you have in the comments down below, I would absolutely love to learn from you. So my third garden flop and failure is this right here, irrigation, and more so just the installation of the irrigation. It was something that I was feeling really overwhelmed with because there is water pressure that you have to be thinking about, the number of different zones that you have, how much hose length you have, and what kind of extensions you have throughout there. And I was doing this all kind of at the peak of the gardening season when I had so much else going on that I needed to be getting into the garden and as well with the business. And so because of that, I was kind of rushing through it and ended up buying more parts than needed. I was putting holes into the hose at the wrong places, and ultimately culminated with water just kind of shooting everywhere, getting me absolutely soaking wet in the springtime. And so my learning and takeaway from this garden fail is that when it comes to garden infrastructure and larger projects, I'm going to be doing those much earlier on in the season rather than doing them kind of at the height of when everything is going into the beds. My hope is that this will give me more time just to kind of relax into it and really go through the process without feeling rushed, because it's when we're in those rushed scenarios and situations that we're more likely to have some form of an issue or challenge come up that's going to then be detrimental to whatever it is that we're building. Okay, so my fourth epic garden fail here, and I would absolutely love your help on this one, is my strawberries. And so what we can see here is that they're growing beautifully. They're green, they're lush, and it's not just foliage. I've got tons and tons of flowers on here, which would then grow into being strawberries. But what I've found this past season is that I've got tons of these flowers, but they aren't growing into those big, beautiful, red, sweet strawberries. They're pollinating and beginning to grow into strawberries, but then they're staying really small and white and then getting sweet. And so I'd love any thoughts from you, any ideas if you've had a lot of success growing strawberries with what's worked well for you. My kind of like experiment that I'm gonna be running and playing around with next year is that I'm actually going to remove a good amount of these flowers. And my hope is that by doing that, it's going to redirect a lot of that energy to a fewer number of strawberries on each one of the plants, and therefore growing larger. But we're gonna have to stay tuned until next year to see if that ends up coming to fruition. All right, we're gonna take a minute or two to warm up in here before going out for number 5 and 6. But for those of you I have not met before, my name is Jordan from Mind and Soil, where we're looking to introduce 1 million individuals to gardening's mental health benefits. So if you're looking to feel more peacefulness, more calmness, more restoration in your life, then go ahead and subscribe, come grow with us. We release new videos every single week to help you feel more comfortable, more confident getting your hands dirty. Now, earlier on in this video, I mentioned I was gonna shed a little bit of light on why I think garden fails and flops are so important. And there's really 2 reasons. The first one actually comes from when I was just a little boy and I was on the ski hill. And I remember towards the end of one of the days on the ski hill, my dad, kind of asking me if I had taken any falls that day, if I had any big falls in my ski lessons, and I said no. And what he shared with me was that, it's really important that we fall on our skis and we have a garden or a skiing fall or failure every time that we go out there, because it's when we're falling that we're actually stretching ourselves, we're going beyond our comfort zone, and we're improving as a skier in that instance. And I so vividly recall thinking about it at that time and it being such a mindset shift where I then started to approach if I fell on my skis as a good thing, because I was pushing myself, I was going beyond where I was comfortable, I was ultimately getting better as a skier. And it's that same mentality that I take into the garden, where when something doesn't go the way that I had hoped or planned, there is a beautiful opportunity in there for me to improve as a gardener and to learn from it and to apply those learnings into subsequent seasons. So I really encourage you to take a similar approach or mentality when it comes to experiencing any garden flops or failures in your garden in the seasons to come, because they are inevitable. And the second piece is that when it comes to new gardeners that are looking to get into gardening, I think a lot of what they might see on the internet right now is all these beautiful harvests and bounties and yields and all the vegetables coming out of it. And that can actually be quite daunting and overwhelming, especially when they then come across their first garden flop or garden fail, which will inevitably happen. And so my big encouragement is to share the flops and the failures that you experience in your garden, because it makes it more welcoming, more inviting, and more inclusive to any new gardeners that are getting their hands dirty for the very first time. So those are the 2 pieces behind why I think garden flops and fails are so important. Let's head back out to the garden now to get to number 5 and number 6, which is so bad. All right, so my 5th garden fail from this past season is this greenhouse right here. And what good is a greenhouse, even if it's warm, if it's not getting any direct sunlight? And so what I want to do is I want to take you around to the other side so I can show you what I mean by that. So I set this greenhouse up where I was hoping to be running some experiments this past season, but what I realized pretty early on was that this big tree right above it here, it essentially blocks the sun, which we're just seeing coming through now, until the middle of the day. It's around 11:30 a.m. right now, and as we can see, it's just now in the last 5 minutes started getting its first few little bits of sun on it. And the challenge is that then as the sun shifts, my house is right there. So once the sun goes beyond that side, it starts to cast a shadow across this greenhouse, and it doesn't receive any sun from that angle either, which means that it's probably only getting 3 to 4 hours of direct sun per day. So my big learning from this greenhouse here is that when it comes to infrastructure pieces that we're doing, such as a greenhouse or putting in raised beds or irrigation, is to not rush into them, but rather to play around with some cheaper options before making that permanent investment. So say with this greenhouse, I've been able to move it around into a couple of different areas, and what I've found is that none of those areas are going to work for that permanent greenhouse. So I'm now able to make a much better investment when I do buy that permanent greenhouse in terms of where I put it in my yard. So don't feel that you need to rush. Feel free to spend time testing out, playing around with different options before making your larger and more permanent infrastructure investments. All right, so the sixth and final garden fail, which I'm not so excited about, is that this past season I got hit with aphids. And I don't mean that like I just saw like one or two on there, but rather they were all over the place on some of my plants, to the point that there were certain leaves on my kale plants that I could barely even see the leaf anymore with how many aphids were on there. And so this is, yeah, not such good news. And it does mean that with all these kale plants behind me here, I'm actually gonna be pulling them all out over the course of the winter rather than letting them grow through the winter, just to try and get as much of that out of the garden as possible. So even though I wasn't thrilled about these aphids, it still presented me with the opportunity to learn and to grow as a gardener. And the first big takeaway that I had from it was inspecting my plants. And when it comes to any of the insects or pests that we get in our garden, if we are inspecting our plants and keeping a close eye on what's going on, we can usually catch any of these problems before they get to something much larger. But this is something that I got a little bit lazy on this past season. And so for next year, especially early on in the season, I'm going to be keeping a closer eye on those plants to see if anything is popping up and to make sure that I'm right on top of it. And the second piece was that it also provided me the opportunity to start playing around with a natural and organic spray to get rid of aphids. And that worked extremely well. And so I'm going to have that on hand next season when I do those early on inspections to make sure that I'm kind of staying on top of anything that might be happening early on and getting rid of those aphids so they don't turn into some kind of larger infestation as I had this past season. So I would absolutely love to hear what your biggest garden fails and flops are in the comments down below. I encourage you to be brave and to share that, because again, it's going to help new gardeners see that it is totally part of the process and it's going to happen to each and every one of us. And if you've enjoyed this video, I encourage you to go and check out a couple of our other videos here, such as how to prep your garden for the winter as we go into it now. So that's all that I have for today. Thanks so much for being along here. I can't wait to catch you on the next one. Go get those hands dirty.